the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns. My co-host is Caitlin Drake, who uses female she, her, hers pronouns. Before we begin, I like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. Over the coming months, we will be sharing a series of episodes featuring conversations with LGBTQ+ Christians as well as leaders of resistance to the traditional plan in Oklahoma. As we lead up to General Conference 2020, and as the Methodist Church continues to deny full inclusion of LGBTQ+ peoples, we feel it is especially important to lift up these voices and experiences. Today, our guests are Reverend Scott Spencer, who is the senior pastor at Mosaic United Methodist Church in Oklahoma City, and Reverend Kathy Brown, the senior pastor at St. Paul's United Methodist Church here in Tulsa. Welcome.
Thank you for having us. Go ahead. I'm glad to be here, and I use the pronouns he, him, and his.
Thank you for having us here, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers.
Both of your congregations are among the few reconciling United Methodist congregations in Oklahoma. What does it mean to be reconciling?
Well, in the United Methodist Church, to be reconciling means that you are accepting of LGBTQ plus persons and that you affirm them in their personhood and that they have the right to marry whoever they want to marry. We also believe that people who feel called into ordained ministry should be obviously reviewed, but that their sexuality should not play a role in whether they should be ordained or not. Who they love or who they're married to should not matter. So we believe LGBTQ persons, even if they're in a married relationship, ought to be able to be ordained and lead churches.
And I would just add to that and say that reconciling churches are ones also that intentionally work to remove barriers of oppression and justice for LGBTQ plus people as well.
The intentionality is a big part of it, intentionally working towards that.
Absolutely.
And increasingly, to be reconciling also means we're intersectional. So we see various groups that face oppression, and we are really working to bring justice to not just LGBTQ community, but to other communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of your churches, when they became reconciling or what that process looked like for them, and then what your congregation is like today?
So Mosaic is a relatively new church in the conference. We are almost 5 years old, but we're the result of a church merger between two churches in Oklahoma City. One was the Leland Clegg Church, which was up in the northeast part of Oklahoma City, and was a church of about 60 years old. And then Epworth United Methodist Church, more closer to Midtown, which at the time of its closing in 2015 was about 100 years old. And Epworth in 1995 received they were a relatively small congregation, shrinking in size, older membership, and Reverend Kathy McCallie was sent there by the bishop to be the pastor with the intention of creating a reconciling congregation. Within a year, the church declared itself to be reconciling. And so the Clegg Church had always been welcoming and affirming and really dealt with a lot of the same issues Epworth did without becoming officially reconciling. But when those churches merged, Mosaic then, from day one, was a reconciling congregation. And so that's really sort of our history.
And for St. Paul's, I've been at St. Paul's now for about 18 months. And as I have visited with people and learned about the DNA of St. Paul's, long before they officially became a reconciling church, they have been a place where people from all walks of life, including LGBTQ+, have felt welcome, have felt at home, and were included in the leadership of the church as well. 5 years ago, they went through the process of becoming reconciling. Actually, on February 23rd, we are going to be celebrating our 5th anniversary of becoming a reconciling church. And my understanding of how that happened was it began with a Sunday school class, and Reverend Twyla Gibbons was the pastor at that time, and when they brought the Sunday school class down forward for the blessing of becoming reconciling, the people in the church went, "Why aren't we all reconciling? Because it's what we believe." And so they went through that process. On that was, what is your congregation like today? And I would say that for St. Paul's, It is still very much so intentional about being affirming for all, and like Scott said, the intersectionality of very clear of we are welcoming and affirming to LGBTQ+, but also to a wide spectrum of those who have been marginalized and oppressed.
You became the pastors of your congregations when they were either already reconciling or right when they were becoming reconciling, but they'd always been affirming. How has your congregation changed since you've taken a stance on inclusion, as in being reconciling? For Kathy, it might be a little bit more difficult because they were already reconciling when you became their pastor. But have you seen kind of a change in throughout your time as the senior pastor of your churches on the stance on inclusion and how your congregation has been impacted?
Well, I think with the passing of the traditional plan, St. Paul's realized that it wasn't enough just to be the reconciling, affirming church. We needed to let people know that this is a safe place. And so we have been much more public in terms of who we are and what we believe. And it's interesting, as I was looking over some of our records over the last year, our membership has increased primarily from people who have transferred from other United Methodist churches to be a part of a reconciling church, especially during this time.
I would just add to that prior to Epworth becoming reconciling in 95, there were many clergy and laity who were working for change in the denomination. And of course, as we all know, the AIDS crisis of the 80s, which was still very much a crisis in the 90s. And when Epworth became reconciling, this was actually before United Methodist Church prohibited clergy from doing what they called same-sex unions. I think that's what the terminology was. And at that time, also in the 90s, a lot of people who came to the church did not want necessarily people to know they were going to a gay-friendly church. For example, teachers feared that they could lose their jobs because of the morality clause, I think, that may even still exist for teachers. And so the idea was the church was public, but yet at the same time didn't want to be too public. It was kind of an awkward situation. I don't know a lot of the history between then and 1995. I've heard stories. One story would be that a pastor, called their district superintendent to say, they want me to be in a pride parade, and is that okay? When I became the pastor, literally within a week or two, same-sex marriage was legal by the Supreme Court. We were also a church that just merged. It was very awkward in a sense of, I didn't know the congregation, they didn't know me. What do we do with this? What do we do with this groundbreaking, earth-shattering news? I think that since then, Mosaic has just become more and more bold in its stance. We have tried to really help Oklahomans lead the way in terms of inclusion. And if we've needed to step up and be a leader, we've tried to do that. And so I just think we've been much more bold. We don't call and ask for permission to do things, and we just do them. And I think that is a freeing thing. So I personally feel like as a pastor, I've become more bold and free, but I think the church has too.
So being in that kind of leadership role is a special kind of calling for you as senior pastors especially. So what led you into this area of ministry? We don't have a lot of reconciling churches in Tulsa, and we don't have a lot of leaders in reconciling churches, or in Oklahoma, rather.
So I'll tell you, the United Methodist Church kind of has an ethos of not necessarily dealing with controversial topics. We don't want to create, a ruckus in our congregations. We don't want to upset people. We as pastors tend to love to talk to people one-on-one or maybe in small groups, but we don't want to preach about these controversial topics. We don't want to write about them in the church newsletter if newsletters are still a thing now. But I think that what happened for me personally was in 2014, the bishop had been quoted twice in the Daily Oklahoman in a span of about 6 months. Both times he said that Methodists follow the Bible. That's all he said. And so he didn't say, what does that actually mean in terms of LGBTQ persons? And he also did not really acknowledge that Methodists can differ and have disagreements and even work for change if they don't agree with it. He just said, well, Methodists follow the Bible. And at the same time, Reverend Frank Schaeffer in Pennsylvania was put on trial for officiating the marriage of his son. And he lost his credentials, at least temporarily. And these two things were happening. At the same time these things were happening, marriage equality became legal in Oklahoma before the Supreme Court ruling. And some of us felt like it was really unfair for the bishop to present to the whole state of Oklahoma, well, Methodists follow the Bible. And so we felt like it was important to get the word out that Methodists actually have a variety of opinions on all kinds of topics, especially LGBTQ topics. And so we began to just speak out. And I will tell you, and people were a little bit hesitant to do that. We had an ad in the paper in Tulsa World and Daily Oklahoman. None of us wanted our name on that ad. And within just a few short months, we did an ad where 100 clergy put their name on the ad. So in just a few months, that boldness kind of came to us. And so I feel like it was important for us to do this, and because it was important for us to let people know that Methodists don't all agree, and that if you happen to be LGBTQ, it is not a matter of that, well, we as Methodists believe that you are incompatible with Christianity, for example, that there are Methodist churches who you are not only welcomed, but you are affirmed and you are celebrated and you're given leadership roles if you have those skills. We wanted people to know that we are not a church that says to LGBTQ people, you are sinners because you're LGBTQ, and you must change in order to be accepted by God and be accepted by us, or you must just remain celibate your whole life. And we felt like it was important for that message to really get out there.
And I would say for me, it didn't start out as an intentional area. I'm second career, so I haven't been doing this for eons like Scott has. But I was a member. Interesting, I heard my call as a member of Epworth, so I was part of a reconciling church. But when I took my first church, which was a wonderful small church in Moore, I started hearing stories. Stories I had heard as a member of the congregation at Epworth, but now these were stories I was hearing as their pastor. And stories of how the church, how pastors, how Sunday school teachers had told people, you are going to hell because of who you are. And people that really felt like they would never find acceptance in a church. And so at that church, I started becoming more aware of the need for pastors to speak out. And then, as most people who are listening to this podcast know, pastors don't choose which church they serve. I was called by my desk and told that I was going to St. Paul's, a reconciling church, I just felt like God was giving me a chance to make my voice even louder, to be able to speak on behalf now, not just of my thoughts, but on behalf of the church as well.
A theme that we've hit on in several previous podcasts is the distinction between being welcoming and being affirming. How do you see the difference between these two concepts, and what does it look like in your congregation?
So virtually every church I know of will say they're welcoming. And I believe that to be true for the most part. But what a conservative church means by welcoming to a gay couple, for example, is we don't want to see you hold hands. We don't want to see you kiss. The things that we don't mind seeing a straight couple do, we don't want you doing in our church. And it probably also means we don't want you teaching Sunday school. We don't want you being a leader. You might be able to sing in the choir, but you can't be a leader. And the underlying theology is also that LGBT people need to recognize their sinfulness and either repent from that, or commit themselves to a life of celibacy. But to be affirming means that we recognize that everyone is a sinner. That's what we as United Methodists believe. We're sinners and saints. But being LGBTQ isn't what makes you a sinner. Being in a relationship is not sinning. And so to affirm people is to say, we believe that God created you, God loves you. If you fall in love with someone of the same gender, we're willing to bless that because we're willing to bless everyone else in this church that falls in love with somebody. There's just a huge difference between welcoming and affirming. And what is hard is that churches will say they welcome you, but they're not upfront about the limitations on that. So people get involved in a church, they may fall in love with the church, they may love the pastor's preaching, they may love the music, and then when they say, I'd like to get married, the church says, oh, wait, we don't approve of that. And that's when you learn really quickly the difference between welcoming and affirming.
I think of welcoming and affirming too, as when we affirm someone, we are saying, we see God's gifts in you, and we want you to share those gifts with us. We want you to help us grow as much as we are going to help you grow. I also think of the difference of welcoming churches. People often say, it feels like family, But I think with affirming churches, this is family. This is my family, because they see all aspects of me, and they really do love and value all those aspects.
One of the hardest things we've had to not really deal with in practice, but more in theory, is that the church used to say all means all. And for us, we've had to ask ourselves, what if a non-affirming person comes to the church? What if somebody comes to the church and they are anti-LGBT? Are we welcoming and affirming of that person? And so, this is hard work. We know that all groups of people, you're not alike. You have differences of opinions, different ways of looking at the world. And so the church is a place where, what does it mean to be in community with people that you may have strong disagreements with? And too often we as human beings, we pull out of those communities because it's uncomfortable and it's hard. But what does it mean to be in a community where you may have disagreements? One area would be the word queer used to be a bad word, and you didn't say that. And younger generations have reclaimed that word and use it. But in our churches, we've got older people who hear that word, and it takes them back to being, on third grade on the playground, and someone's calling them a queer or worse. And so we've had to struggle a little bit in our church with using that language. And I have said from the pulpit, if we're going to welcome everybody, then what does it mean to welcome a younger person that they've used that word their whole life? And when they go out with their LGBTQ friends, they use that word and it's a positive thing, whereas we may hear it as a bad word. But what does it mean if we're going to say we're welcoming of all people? And so this is really hard work, to be in community under Christ, but have differences of opinion.
So thinking about our church communities, and as you said, Kathy, it is family. I think following General Conference 2019, some of our families felt that impact different than other families maybe felt it. Can you talk a little bit about what pastoral care looked like for both of you leading up to and through the special session of the General Conference?
It's been hard because there has been a great deal of hurt that came as a direct result of some of the decisions that were made at the February General Conference. I think for us at St. Paul's and maybe other reconciling churches, we had the insulation of being there and being supportive of one another. But there also is that very realness of, I don't know how long we can keep asking, especially our LGBTQ+, but also those in our congregations who believe, the straight allies who believe so strongly that the church should be a place of full inclusion. I don't know how long we keep saying, just wait, keep fighting, just wait.
We've been saying that since 1972.
Exactly. And so that's where the pastoral care has been noticeable in helping people through hurt, but then also helping them deal with their frustrations of, I might be ready to be done.
So when pastoring a church that's reconciling is no different than pastoring any other kind of church in terms of pastoral care. People get sick, they're in the hospital, they die, people are having surgeries, people are losing their jobs. And I think there's many LGBTQ persons in the United Methodist Church who say, we're tired of being the focus of this. We don't want the spotlight on us. We want to live our lives like anyone else without this being the constant topic being talked about. So I have people that, quite honestly, don't keep up with the United Methodist news, as shocking as that might be. And so pastoral care is different for them versus people who keep up with it religiously. And as a pastor, I even want to say, I'm tired of talking about it. And we have people, especially that have worked for decades to create change. And some of them are tired, and they don't want to give up on change, but they're tired of working in the United Methodist Church for change. In some ways, they've turned the reins over to the next generation. I had many people very upset after St. Louis, and people said, I don't want to leave Mosaic, but I want to remove my membership from the United Methodist Church. Now, nobody ever actually followed through with that. I had people that said, I won't wear our Mosaic t-shirts anymore because it says United Methodist and it has the cross and flame on it. A few of them have since worn those t-shirts, and I've said to them, hey, I see you wearing that t-shirt. And they said, well, I've cooled down a little bit. I've lost at least one person who didn't remove their membership but quit coming and said, I just can't deal with the Methodist drama anymore. I'm sick of it. And so pastoral care is all of that. It's people like Kathy and myself taking care of ourselves and taking care of our families and friends and taking care of our churches. And whether it's debating the rules of the Book of Discipline and the what ifs, or whether it's holding someone's hand in the hospital who's facing a life-threatening illness, it's just life. But I can tell you that we're ready to tackle other topics as well. Mm-hmm. Racism, sexism, human trafficking in Oklahoma, education, gun violence, all of that is important. Interfaith relationships. So.
And then I just have to put a plug in for public education as well.
Absolutely.
We're facing another general conference this May. How is this upcoming general conference impacting your congregation?
I will tell you that for Mosaic, and this is public knowledge, we have made a public statement that says, if things don't change at this general conference, we're ready to walk away from the denomination. Now, we're waiting to see what happens. And as we know, sometimes change is a slow process, but we believe the time is now for change. And I believe that between general conference, between annual conference and then jurisdictional conference, which happens, I think, in July, we're going to have a lot of things happening. So I'm certainly, as the pastor, going to try to say, let's wait till after jurisdictional conference at least to see where we want to go next. For many of my people, they want Mosaic to flourish without focusing solely on the drama of the United Methodist Church. They want to see us acting like a church that is vibrant and growing and making an impact without this being the focus of it. And so as the pastor, I've had to kind of balance that, keeping my people informed while at the same time not just belaboring the point of what's going on in the denomination.
I would agree with that. It's that balance. And in any church, you have some people that want lots of information and others who they're coming to church on Sunday morning and involved with ministries and activities because that's just what they do, and they want to stay away from the politics of it all. But I think in terms of preparing for general conference, part of that is holding on to the hope, that change is possible. We've said that, like you said, since 1972, but even before 1972, people were looking for things of how are we going to continue to grow and develop as the church, as the risen body of Christ, and there's always hope with that.
I want to just add that, I was very proud of the fact that here in Tulsa and in Lawton and in Oklahoma City, we had these services of resistance on the first weekend in January. That's part of our preparation, I think, for General Conference. Also, I know here in Tulsa, you recently had a service about commitments and relationships. At Mosaic, at the end of February, we're going to have I can't even think of the name of it right now, but a drag show fundraiser for missions. But part of that is our act of resistance, and a leader in my church has invited some of the drag queens in Oklahoma City to come and perform, and part of that is singing, but part of that's also storytelling. Some of the drag queens said, "Wait, you want us to do this in a church?" They were kind of shocked by that, but I know that the intent of this is to affirm them and what they do, and to show them that the church is a safe and welcoming place as well. And so I'm very excited to see what's going to come of this. And part of that is our preparation for General Conference. It's been titled part of the title is resistance, and I know part of that is this is who we are, and we're not going to wait to be who we are. We're going to be who we are now, today.
So you mentioned that being a reconciling church also means being intersectional in how you welcome and affirm individuals and peoples. Can you talk about pastoring a wide range of identities? I think every pastor faces this, but particularly for a church that has that so front and center with how you lead and how you walk in the world.
So all of our churches have a wide range of identities, and some churches are obviously more conservative and some more liberal and some more centrist. At Mosaic, I've jokingly said, but it's actually true, that if you go to any church in Oklahoma, chances are it's going to be the majority conservative with a minority of liberal people. Those liberal people have learned how to sort of navigate the church and exist in the church and thrive in the church. But at Mosaic, it's kind of the opposite. The majority of our people are more progressive, are more liberal. We have a minority of people who are more conservative, and I'm talking maybe politically mostly, but even theologically, we have some somewhat traditionalist type people in terms of what they want out of worship and whatnot. Being a pastor at my church means that that we have everything from older people and their views and younger people and their views, and people who've grown up in the church, they're brand new to the church by being a part of Mosaic. We have people that are gay who don't want to go to pride parades. They don't. And then we have straight people that, are constantly wearing rainbow flags on their clothing, and no matter what they're doing, they have a rainbow something on them, a hat or whatever. It's just a wide mixture of people. A funny thing is that we share our building space with another church. And after a few weeks, one of the members said to me, "I assumed that everyone in a reconciling church was gay." And they learned that we have straight people at Mosaic, and this was a shock to them. So it's interesting, people's assumptions and their life and what we experience and whatnot. And so being a pastor of Mosaic is no different than being a pastor anywhere else, really.
We recently worked on a statement of resistance after General Conference. And as our administrative council looked at that and started talking about it, what they realized is the beauty of St. Paul's, like so many churches, is the diversity among us. And it's not just gender identity, sexual expression. It is income level, education, life experiences, all of that. And that is the beauty. That is what makes us that church. And so how do you pastor that? Like Scott said, so many churches have that, but it's recognizing that when you say something from the pulpit, especially because you don't get that automatic feedback like you do if you're in a Sunday school class, you have to think about how is this going to fall on one set of ears versus another, and be intentional about that.
When church leaders or churches don't articulate a stance on LGBTQ plus inclusion, what does that communicate to you or the congregation that you pastor?
This is an interesting question because churches should not be afraid to say who they are and what they believe. But I think this issue is so divisive in our society, but people are becoming more accepting, that a lot of pastors don't want to identify, what they believe, and the church sort of doesn't want to identify it either. And what it communicates to me is that they're willing to let LGBTQ people be clueless about what their church believes. Would a person know if this is this a safe church for them to come to? Or will they be blindsided when they walk in? Maybe they like the music, they like the pastor, they meet people, and all of a sudden they find out this is not a truly welcoming and affirming church. So we've recently had a woman visit our church, and she said, I saw your banner that was outside in the yard of your church all last summer, and it had a rainbow flag on it. And she said, I drove by that every single day. And I didn't say anything, and she said, my brother is gay. So here it was in December, and she was coming to our church. She wouldn't have come if she didn't see that rainbow flag. I mean, she specifically wanted me to know she came to the church because her brother is gay. And so that's what a rainbow flag does. That's what articulating clearly what you believe does. It lets people know what kind of church you are. And if you don't say that, in some ways you're harming LGBTQ people, because it's almost as if they're not worth letting them. You're saying, you're not worthy enough for me to let you know what kind of church this is. And that may sound a little bit harsh, but it really, I think, is true.
I think part of that, too, is that pastors have to know the context of their congregation, and they have to know who their congregation is. It seems like last year, much to my surprise, we had a lot of movement around the Methodist Church in terms of appointments. And so right in the midst of all of this with General Conference, pastors moving to a new place, they don't know the congregation. They don't know the beliefs of that. And so I think sometimes it's a matter of building trust first, so that then people understand, as a pastor, I'm trying to get you to think about things. I'm trying to help you to understand, how does your faith inform your decision about that.
I also want to just add that some churches truly don't have a stance because they have such a wide variety of people in the church. And they may have half the church that's pro-LGBT and half the church that's not. So that church truly doesn't have a stance to take. And I understand that. I appreciate that. I've pastored churches like that. I think the key for me is, are they willing to have discussions around this issue, or are they sort of sweeping it under the rug and not talking about it? And that's a big difference to me.
And I think what Scott said about letting people know who you are as a church is important. One of the most impactful stories I heard was about a gay man who was asked to leave his church, because of his sexuality. But because church was important, he wanted to find another church. And he would talk about pulling into the parking lot and his heart just racing, because he didn't know when he would walk in the door how he would be accepted or treated. And so, like Scott said, by being able to have a semblance of this is who we are.
And I think what you mentioned, Kathy, something that's come up in previous podcasts and in other spaces where we're doing this kind of resist harm work, is this idea of religious trauma, that particularly for folks in the LGBTQ plus community, that churches are not always safe spaces, and you do have question marks, and you do have anxiety, and you have been told to leave before, and you've been invalidated before. So, you're in a really, I think, unique situation as a pastor, leading people who may have been harmed by churches and by invalidating theologies that churches are perpetuating. So what is that like? How do you navigate that?
Well, and I would say it's not just for our LGBTQ plus people. We have a lot of people that have been traumatized by the church based on a theology of, you are going to hell unless you do X, Y, Z. And one of the things I've learned as a pastor is that oftentimes when a person comes in visiting a church, sometimes they come because they've been to church all their life, they've moved into the neighborhood, they're looking for a church. But so often what happens is an event has happened in someone's life. There has been some type of trauma, and maybe religious trauma that's happened, and they come to church. And what do they feel that first time when they walk in the door? Is this a place that feels safe, where I can have questions, where I can let my wounds heal. And I think that's part of that difference that we talked about earlier of the difference between welcoming and affirming. A welcoming church says, yeah, come on in. An affirming church says, no matter who you are, this can be a place where you can work on letting God and the congregation help you heal those wounds.
I agree with what Kathy said. This is about everybody. We're all on a journey, and none of us are at the same spot in our journey. Pastors are no different. I say to my church all the time, I don't have all the answers, but I can help us together, on this journey. One of the things as pastors, sometimes we're the ones who pick the hymns, sometimes we're not, but every church I've been a part of, you've got hymns you like, hymns you don't like, various reasons, but never have I spent so much time analyzing hymns as I do now that I'm the pastor of Mosaic. We had our Resist service in January. The first hymn we sang was a beautiful hymn. I'd only heard it once before. It's not in our Methodist hymnal. But it referenced something that caused somebody to be hurt. And I got a letter in the mail about it. And it was a reminder to me that I had picked this song without truly looking at every word and every verse and thinking, how will this song come across in this community? And so as a pastor at Mosaic, we look at every hymn, every liturgy for baptism, liturgy for communion, the words we use, the actions we do, because we want to be a safe haven. And we talk about that. We want to be an oasis in the midst of the Oklahoma City metro area. And you're always going to say something that's going to rub somebody the wrong way. That's just life. And that's part of what it means to learn to be in community. But we try to be very intentional because many of the people, I would say at least half or more of the people at Mosaic, come from more conservative backgrounds, more conservative denominations, and they have been hurt, but they're deeply spiritual people. They want to be a part of a faith community. But some things just trigger in them things from their past, which can be very hurtful and harmful. So we're very aware of that at Mosaic.
Where do you find hope for the future of the church?
I think as long as we all remember what the church is, not that religious institution, a particular denomination, but when we think of the church as being the embodiment of Christ, the risen body of Christ, to me, that's where the hope is. I don't know what's going to happen to the United Methodist Church, and I don't think anybody today does. And so I'm not going to put the hope in whatever happens at General Conference, because I had hope in February. But my hope is that if we stay focused, I don't like that phrase because to me it's just thrown out there without context to it. But when people say, don't worry, God is in control, that's not how God works. It's not a God of poof. It is God working through people. And so if we respond to that and respond to be the risen body of Christ, for me, that's where the hope is.
I think for me, when we feel like we're at our lowest, somebody new comes to the church, and you think, why do you want to come to this church? But they do, and they're excited about it. When we're at our lowest and we're gathered around the communion table, and you're serving, a small child perhaps who just holds out their hands, and they want just a little bit more of that bread, or you have a service where it ends and you really feel like God's Spirit showed up and you just feel like this is what church is supposed to be. And that happens after a time of our deepest, darkest sorrow, and such as General Conference. That's when I have hope. At General Conference, I was there when our bishop came up into the area where the visitors were. I was surrounded by a lot of Oklahoma clergy and a lot of Oklahoma laity, which were mostly college students from Oklahoma City University. And as I looked at those college students, and they love the church, they want to be a part of the church, they were deeply hurting, but I had hope because they were not just walking away. They weren't saying to the bishop, we're out of here, we're done. They were asking, what can we do to make it better? And so there's hope all around us. You just have to remember that. And you have to be open to that, and you have to have that expectation, that spirit of expectation that God is always going to show up and something good is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I'm just really glad Boston Avenue has taken the stances that they've taken in recent years. For many, many years. I mean, Boston Avenue has been a leader in our conference, obviously. But your stances that you're taking, especially for the LGBT community, helps us all. These podcasts, for example, a way of being bold and getting the word out. And in many ways, you are leading us in the conference. And so I'm grateful for the leadership of Boston Avenue. And
I would second that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks.
This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We're located at 1301 South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.